For 6 years, my mother was drugging me with psychiatric medications without my knowledge, and when I discovered it and stopped, she told the psychiatrist I was having a psychotic break and tried to have me institutionalized. The constant dizziness that had dominated my existence for at least 6 years intensified suddenly that Thursday morning when I tried to get out of our bed and had to hold firmly onto the wooden nightstand to avoid collapsing completely on the bedroom floor. While Rodrigo watched worriedly from the other side, asking for the 1,000th time if I shouldn't finally see a specialist about those inexplicable symptoms that general practitioners had been treating superficially with vague diagnoses of chronic stress, generalized anxiety, or simply accumulated fatigue from busy modern life without ever deeply investigating the real causes of that progressive physical deterioration that was gradually transforming a previously active and healthy woman into a pale and exhausted version, constantly fighting against a mental fog that made it difficult to concentrate, remember things, and especially to function normally in daily activities that should have been automatic and effortless. My 35 years of existence built meticulously on foundations of a promising career as an architect, working in a respected firm, an apparently stable 8-year marriage to Rodrigo, and especially on the comforting certainty that I understood my own physical and mental health reasonably well, were finally beginning to crumble under the growing weight of symptoms that made no logical sense when considered collectively. Extreme fatigue even after full nights of sleep, growing difficulty processing simple information at work, resulting in embarrassing professional mistakes I had never made before, inexplicable mood changes oscillating dramatically between profound emotional apathy and paralyzing anxiety without identifiable triggers, and especially that persistent sensation of living inside an aquarium where external reality arrived filtered and distorted through invisible layers that separated my consciousness from the concrete world around me. Rodrigo had been gently insisting for months that something was fundamentally wrong beyond simple occupational stress or situational anxiety that general practitioners superficially diagnosed during 15-minute consultations focused on prescribing mild anti-anxiety medications instead of investigating the underlying causes of that progressive deterioration. But part of me resisted admitting that perhaps I needed deeper psychiatric evaluation because I carried internalized stigma about mental illness inherited from decades of subtle social messages, characterizing people who needed psychological help as fundamentally weak or defective, instead of simply human beings facing legitimate neurological challenges that deserved compassionate treatment based on solid scientific evidence. The decision that finally completely changed my life's trajectory happened on a hot Tuesday afternoon when Dr. Renata, a family physician who had recently started seeing me after a health insurance change, observed carefully during a routine follow-up consultation that the specific set of symptoms I reported: extreme fatigue, mental disorientation, subtle hand tremors, and especially that particular quality of cognitive disconnection I described as a permanent fog surrounding my thoughts, resembled the characteristic pattern of side effects from heavy psychotropic medications rather than primary symptoms of a genuine mental or physical disorder that would justify additional prescriptions without deeper investigation into possible medication, related or toxic causes. Carolina, I know this may sound strange considering you've told me repeatedly that you don't take any medications besides occasional vitamins, but I need to ask you something important. Doctor, Renata began with that particular combination of medical professionalism and human intuition that characterized truly exceptional doctors who had learned over decades of practice to trust their instincts when clinical patterns didn't make complete sense through conventional diagnostic lenses. I'd like to request a comprehensive toxicology panel, including specific tests for the presence of psychiatric medications like benzodiazepines, antipsychotics, and mood stabilizers that could explain the symptoms you've been experiencing for so long without a definitive diagnosis or effective treatment that actually improves your quality of life, instead of simply masking underlying problems. Dr. Renata's suggestion about performing toxicology tests for medications I was absolutely certain I had never consciously consumed seemed initially bizarre and unnecessary, but something in the professional seriousness with which she presented that recommendation convinced me to agree to the tests, even without completely understanding the rationale behind that apparently random investigation of substances that logically shouldn't be present in my system. During the following 5 days while awaiting laboratory results, I continued my normal work routine interspersed with regular dinners at my mother Marta's house, who lovingly insisted on preparing elaborate meals for me and Rodrigo at least 3 times a week, claiming maternal concern about my deteriorating health and the need to ensure I was receiving adequate nutrition through home Cooked meals prepared with fresh ingredients, and especially with the unconditional love of a devoted mother, caring for a daughter clearly going through a difficult period. The phone call from Dr. Renata that I received on a gray Monday morning while sitting alone in the architecture office trying to concentrate on architectural plans that swam incomprehensibly before my eyes through that familiar mental fog instantly transformed my complete understanding of the reality I had unconsciously inhabited for at least 6 years. Carolina, I need you to come to the office immediately to discuss the toxicology panel results because we found something extremely concerning that requires urgent action, Dr. Renata said in a controlled voice, but obviously loaded with profound seriousness that made my heart race, anticipating devastating news about compromised health or serious undiagnosed illness. When I finally sat in the upholstered chair in the medical office 30 minutes later, having crossed the entire city in a state of growing anxiety about what possible medical discoveries awaited revelation, Dr. Renata positioned herself behind the desk, organizing papers methodically before looking directly into my eyes with an expression that combined professional compassion with barely contained indignation about the situation she was about to reveal. Carolina, the toxicology results show significant presence of 3 different psychiatric medications in your system. An atypical antipsychotic used primarily to treat schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. A high-potency benzodiazepine generally prescribed for severe anxiety, and a mood stabilizer commonly used to control manic episodes. She explained with clinical clarity that contrasted drastically with the absolute incredulity dominating my mind, processing the impossibility of that information. The silence that dominated the medical office for long seconds after Dr. Renata's revelation was so dense and oppressive that I physically felt the weight of those impossible words hovering in the artificial air conditioning between us, while my consciousness frantically struggled to construct rational explanations about how 3 heavy psychiatric medications I had never consciously consumed could be circulating through my system, causing all those debilitating symptoms that previous doctors had vaguely attributed to stress or anxiety, instead of recognizing the obvious pattern of chronic medication poisoning. Doctor, this is absolutely impossible because I don't take any of those medications. I've never been diagnosed with any psychiatric condition that would justify prescriptions of that type. And especially, I've always been extremely careful about what substances I put in my body, including avoiding even over-the-counter medications like common painkillers unless absolutely necessary. I protested in a voice that progressively rose in volume, driven by confusion, rapidly transforming into panic about the implications of that impossible medical discovery. Doctor. Renata remained silent briefly, allowing me to process the initial shock before continuing with clinical analysis that revealed years of experience identifying suspicious patterns, suggesting situations beyond simple medical errors or mistaken diagnoses. Carolina, the concentrations of these medications in your blood suggest regular and sustained administration over a prolonged period, probably years based on how your system demonstrates metabolic adaptation characteristic of chronic exposure, she explained methodically. This is not the result of accidental contamination or a single prescription error, but rather a pattern consistent with someone deliberately administering these medications without your knowledge or conscious consent, which constitutes a serious crime of poisoning or chemical assault, depending on specific jurisdiction legislation. Dr. Renata's words about deliberate and sustained administration of heavy psychiatric medications without my knowledge created an alternative reality so disturbing and incomprehensible that initially my mind simply refused to completely process the implications of that possibility. Who would have regular enough access to my food or drink to sustain chronic poisoning for years? Who would possess such a bizarre and cruel motivation to deliberately incapacitate someone through medications that caused exactly the debilitating symptoms I had progressively experienced for at least 6 years, gradually transforming a functional woman into a confused and exhausted version constantly fighting against inexplicable mental fog? The obvious but absolutely unthinkable answer was beginning to emerge reluctantly from my subconscious, where it had remained buried under layers of protective denial. My own mother Marta was the only person with consistent access to my meals through those regular 3 times weekly dinners she lovingly insisted on preparing, claiming maternal concern about my adequate nutrition. The physical nausea that accompanied that devastating realization about possible maternal responsibility for my chronic poisoning was so intense that I had to run to the office bathroom, vomiting violently, while processing the fundamental betrayal of filial trust that had been systematically violated for years through deliberate acts disguised as loving maternal care. When I finally returned to the office with a pale face and hands trembling uncontrollably, Dr. Renata had prepared a glass of water, and especially had begun methodically documenting the entire situation in official medical records that would be crucial for subsequent investigations into the source of that chronic medication poisoning, and especially into the criminal responsibility of whoever was perpetrating that sustained chemical abuse. Carolina, I need to inform you that as a medical professional, I have a legal obligation to report suspected cases of abuse or poisoning to appropriate authorities. But before we make any formal complaint, I need you to carefully consider who would have both regular access to your food and possible motivation to administer these specific medications without your knowledge. Doctor, Renata said with firm gentleness that recognized the emotional sensitivity of that investigation while simultaneously maintaining professional focus on discovering objective truth about the source of the poisoning. During the following 20 minutes, I detailed my weekly routine, including regular dinners at Marta's house, and especially mentioned that my mother had a history of controlling behavior over my life that had progressively intensified after my marriage to Rodrigo 8 years ago, as if she resented the loss of direct influence over the adult daughter's decisions in establishing an independent family. Doctor, Renata's expression changed subtly from professional concern to something darker that suggested recognition of a familiar pattern from similar cases she had probably encountered during decades of medical practice, treating victims of family abuse in its most insidious and difficult to detect manifestations. Carolina, I need to ask you something delicate. Has your mother ever shown unusual interest in mental health issues? Does she have access to psychiatric medications through her own prescriptions or those of other people? Or especially, has she ever suggested that you should seek psychiatric treatment even when you didn't perceive a need for such intervention? She questioned with evident care, trying not to plant suggestions, but simultaneously guiding the investigation toward territories that clinical experience suggested were relevant to understanding potentially toxic family dynamics. Doctor, Renata's question awakened a specific memory that had remained buried in my subconscious as an irrelevant detail, but that now assumed sinister meaning retrospectively, approximately 6 years before, coinciding exactly with the onset of my inexplicable symptoms. Marta had casually mentioned during a family dinner that she was taking psychiatric medications prescribed by a specialist to treat anxiety and chronic insomnia, and especially had repeatedly commented during the following months that perhaps I should consider seeing the same psychiatrist, because I was clearly showing signs of stress that could benefit from appropriate pharmacological intervention. At the time, I interpreted those comments as legitimate maternal concern about my well-being. But now, with the devastating perspective provided by the toxicology discovery, that memory revealed the possible origin of the medications someone had secretly administered for years through carefully prepared food, served 3 times weekly under the pretext of unconditional maternal love. Dr. Renata, I think I know who may have done this to me and why. But I need to confirm before making such serious accusations against my own mother. I managed to articulate in a controlled voice despite the internal emotional chaos threatening to explode in complete collapse. I need to go home immediately and confront Rodrigo about whether he also noticed a suspicious pattern in my symptoms consistently worsening after dinners at my mother's house. And especially, I need to plan how to approach this impossible situation where I discovered that the person who should protect me above all apparently spent years systematically poisoning me for reasons I still can't completely understand. Doctor, Renata nodded understandingly, but quickly warned about the need to act cautiously to avoid potentially dangerous direct confrontations with a person clearly capable of extreme manipulative behavior sustained for years without showing remorse or hesitation. The return trip home was a surreal experience where the familiar reality I had unconsciously inhabited for 35 years of existence was being systematically deconstructed and replaced with a disturbing alternative version, where a loving mother was actually the perpetrator of chronic chemical abuse, designed to incapacitate her daughter through medications that caused exactly the symptoms I had vaguely attributed to stress or anxiety, instead of recognizing as evidence of deliberate poisoning. Each memory of dinner at Marta's house was reinterpreted through a new and devastating lens. Those elaborate dishes prepared with such apparent care were not expressions of maternal love, but rather vehicles for secret administration of medications that gradually destroyed my cognitive capacity, emotional stability, and especially professional functioning, transforming a competent architect into a confused and exhausted version incapable of executing simple tasks without extraordinary effort. When I finally got home, I found Rodrigo working remotely in the home office. And immediately, without any adequate emotional preparation, I began frantically relating the toxicology discovery and especially the growing suspicion about Marta's responsibility for years of systematic poisoning disguised as maternal care. Rodrigo remained in shocked silence, processing the impossible information I was rapidly pouring out through a disorganized verbal torrent, driven by adrenaline, and especially by the urgent need for external validation about the objective reality of that situation, instead of it being simply paranoid delusion that my traumatized mind was fabricating as a psychological defense mechanism against an even more disturbing truth about genuine mental deterioration without identifiable external cause. Carolina, this explains absolutely everything about the pattern I had noticed but never verbalized because it seemed too conspiratorial to be actual reality. Rodrigo finally responded in a controlled voice but obviously loaded with growing fury. Your symptoms always worsened dramatically in the 24 hours following dinners at your mother's house. You became especially confused and disoriented exactly on the days following those elaborate meals she insisted so much on preparing personally without allowing anyone to help in the kitchen. And especially Marta always showed peculiar interest in knowing in detail how you were feeling after eating her food, as if she were monitoring the effectiveness of dosages secretly administered through those carefully prepared dishes. Rodrigo's validation about the suspicious pattern he had independently observed but never mentioned offered devastating confirmation that the suspicion about maternal responsibility was not simply paranoia induced by the trauma of discovering medication poisoning, but rather a logical conclusion based on circumstantial evidence that all converged, pointing to the same impossible and unthinkable source. The decision about how to proceed by directly confronting Marta versus simply cutting contact and reporting to authorities without giving her an opportunity to offer explanations or justifications was emotionally complex, because a significant part of me still resisted completely accepting that my own mother had deliberately poisoned me for years, for motivations that remained obscure, but certainly would involve deep levels of psychological pathology or calculated malice, incomprehensible through lenses of normal and healthy maternal relationship. Rodrigo, I need to go confront my mother right now and demand explanations about why she did this to me for so many years, ruining my health, career, and especially our marital quality of life through debilitating symptoms I attributed to personal failures, instead of recognizing as the result of deliberate poisoning. I declared with impulsive determination, born from fury that finally overcame the initial paralyzing shock. Rodrigo immediately objected with legitimate concern about personal safety in directly confronting a person clearly capable of extreme and sustained manipulative behavior, but eventually agreed to accompany me, ensuring that at least there would be a witness present during a confrontation that could potentially escalate to violence if Marta perceived that the elaborate control she had maintained for years was finally being exposed and challenged through irrefutable medical evidence about the presence of medications she had secretly administered. The trip to Marta's house, located in a quiet residential neighborhood where I had grown up during an apparently normal and happy childhood, was a physically short but emotionally devastating journey, where each familiar block evoked memories of decades of maternal relationship that needed to be completely reinterpreted through a new and disturbing lens about a mother who apparently had never been the loving and protective person I believed I knew intimately, but rather a calculated manipulator capable of perpetrating chronic chemical abuse against her own daughter, for motivations that remained mysterious, but would certainly be revealed during the imminent confrontation that would irreversibly transform the nature of all future family relationships, regardless of what explanations or justifications Marta could offer for such inexplicable and cruel behavior. When I arrived at Marta's house, located 3 blocks beyond our residence that late afternoon, charged with electric tension, where each second seemed to last eternities, while my mind frantically processed the devastating implications of the toxicology discovery that completely transformed my understanding about 6 years of debilitating symptoms erroneously attributed to stress or anxiety. I found my mother sitting calmly on the external porch of the family home where I grew up during an apparently normal childhood, drinking iced tea as if it were a common afternoon instead of a moment that would irreversibly define the nature of all future family relationships. The expression on Marta's face when she saw me approaching, accompanied by Rodrigo, changed subtly from initial surprise to something more calculated that suggested she had anticipated eventually this confrontation about medications secretly administered for years through carefully prepared meals served 3 times weekly under the pretext of unconditional maternal love, but clearly didn't expect the discovery to happen so soon, or through methods as scientifically irrefutable as a toxicology exam revealing the presence of 3 heavy psychiatric medications circulating through my blood system. Carolina, what a surprise to see you here midweek when you're normally busy with work at the architecture office. Marta began with that particular tone of false cordiality I had learned over decades to recognize as a social mask covering underlying calculated manipulations. Rodrigo is here too. I imagine you've come to talk about something important that couldn't wait until our regular Friday dinner. The casual mention of the regular dinners where she had systematically poisoned her own daughter for at least 6 years made my stomach turn violently while I struggled to maintain the emotional composure necessary for rational confrontation. Marta, we need to talk immediately about something extremely serious I discovered today through medical tests. I managed to articulate in a controlled voice despite my hands visibly trembling, holding the envelope containing toxicology results that categorically proved the presence of medications I had never consciously consumed. Can I come into the house, or do you prefer we have this conversation here on the porch, where neighbors can potentially hear details about criminal practices you apparently perpetrated against me for years without any apparent hesitation or remorse? The deliberately confrontational tone was calculated to immediately establish the seriousness of the situation, and especially to observe Marta's initial reactions when directly confronted with accusations about systematic poisoning. Marta's expression perceptibly hardened, processing my words loaded with implicit accusation about criminal behavior, but quickly recovered manipulative composure, strategically adjusting the mask of a concerned mother unjustly attacked by an ungrateful daughter demonstrating inexplicable aggressive behavior. Carolina, I don't know what you're insinuating with these dramatic accusations about criminal practices, but I suggest you come into the house and calmly explain what's happening, instead of making a scene on my porch where neighbors really can hear and form completely mistaken impressions about our family dynamic. She responded in a tone that tried to sound reasonable but carried an underlying threat about potential social consequences of public confrontation. We entered the family house, crossing through the living room decorated with furniture that remained practically unchanged since my childhood, each object evoking memories of decades of family life that needed to be completely reinterpreted through a new and devastating lens about a mother who apparently had never been the loving and protective person I believed I knew intimately during 35 years of existence. Marta sat in her favorite armchair, positioned strategically to visually dominate the room, creating a power dynamic where she occupied an elevated position while visitors remained on lower sofas. But this time, I chose to remain standing, refusing to participate in that manipulative choreography of spatial dominance. Explain to me, Marta, how 3 different psychiatric medications ended up circulating in my blood system as revealed by the comprehensive toxicology exam that my family physician specifically requested, because the symptoms I experienced for 6 years resembled the characteristic pattern of chronic medication poisoning instead of genuine mental disorder. I began methodically removing medical documentation from the envelope and placing papers on the coffee table where Marta would be forced to visualize concrete evidence about the crimes she had systematically perpetrated. The identified medications include an atypical antipsychotic used to treat schizophrenia, a high-potency benzodiazepine for severe anxiety, and a mood stabilizer for manic episodes, none of which was prescribed to me by any legitimate doctor during my entire adult life. The silence that dominated the room after my presentation of toxicology evidence was so dense and charged with tension that I physically felt the weight of that transformative moment hovering in the artificial air conditioning between us, while I observed Marta's expression changing through a revealing sequence of micro-expressions. Initial surprise about the discovery, quick calculation about possible denial or justification strategies, and finally partial resignation upon realizing that medical evidence was too concrete to be simply refuted through characteristic direct lies or verbal manipulations she normally employed to control family narratives. Carolina, I don't know how those medications appeared in your tests, but certainly there are rational explanations that don't involve absurd accusations about your own mother deliberately poisoning you for years. Marta finally responded in a voice that tried to maintain a tone of offended indignation, but betrayed growing nervousness through small hesitations and postural adjustments indicating psychological discomfort. Perhaps the laboratory made an error mixing your samples with another patient's, or perhaps you unconsciously consumed medications from some source you don't clearly remember, due to the confusion symptoms you've been experiencing in recent years. Marta's transparent attempt to plant doubts about the reliability of laboratory results or about my own memory revealed exactly the manipulative pattern I had observed for decades, but never completely recognized as evidence of deep psychological pathology, instead of simply controlling personality traits that many mothers demonstrate in varying degrees. Marta, the concentrations of these medications in my blood indicate regular and sustained administration over a prolonged period, probably years, as the doctor explained, based on metabolic adaptation of my system. I continued implacably refusing to allow her to deflect responsibility through unlikely conspiracy theories about laboratory errors. The only person with consistent and regular access to my meals during exactly this period was you. Through those weekly dinners you insisted so much on preparing personally without allowing anyone to help in the kitchen. Rodrigo, who had remained silent observing that initial confrontation, finally intervened with an analysis that connected circumstantial evidence he had independently noticed but never verbalized, because it seemed too conspiratorial to represent objective reality. Marta, for years I observed a consistent pattern where Carolina became especially confused and disoriented in the 24 hours following dinners at your house, and you always showed peculiar interest in monitoring in detail how she was feeling after eating your elaborate meals, exactly as someone secretly administering medications would do to evaluate the effectiveness of applied dosages. He declared with firmness that surprised even me with the contentiousness of the direct accusation. Marta's expression changed drastically upon realizing that both I and Rodrigo had independently arrived at the same inevitable conclusion about her responsibility for the chronic poisoning, eliminating the possibility of continuing to deny through unlikely alternative explanations or verbal manipulations that could work against only one person doubting their own mental sanity. You two have clearly united to construct a paranoid narrative about me based on coincidences interpreted through a lens of suspicion instead of family love. She tried to counterattack appealing to emotional loyalties that traditionally work to control family members' behavior through manufactured guilt. What kind of daughter accuses her own mother of a crime as heinous as deliberate poisoning based only on test results that could have multiple innocent explanations? The kind of daughter who spent 6 years of her life fighting debilitating symptoms that ruined her professional career, marital relationship, and especially overall quality of life, while doctors vaguely attributed problems to stress, without ever investigating the possibility of medication poisoning, because basic trust in family suggested such investigation would be unnecessary and paranoid. I responded with growing fury that finally overcame years of psychological conditioning to always prioritize family peace over objective truth. The kind of daughter who discovered through irrefutable medical evidence that the person who should protect her above all was actually spending years deliberately incapacitating her through heavy psychiatric medications, secretly administered for motivations I still don't completely understand but will certainly discover. Marta remained silent for long moments, apparently processing strategic calculation about whether to continue denying responsibility, risking legal escalation based on already collected evidence, or whether to change tactics offering justifications that could potentially minimize perception of deliberate malice transforming crimes into actions motivated by distorted maternal concern. Carolina, if I administered those medications in your food, it was only because I was genuinely worried about your mental health deteriorating progressively, and you refused to seek appropriate psychiatric treatment despite obvious signs that you needed pharmacological intervention, she finally admitted with calculated reformulation characterizing criminal poisoning as well. Intentioned, if ethically questionable, maternal care. Marta's partial admission about having deliberately medicated her own daughter without her consent or knowledge, even wrapped in justifications about legitimate maternal concerns, finally confirmed beyond any reasonable doubt that my own mother had perpetrated systematic chemical abuse for years, destroying my physical health, cognitive capacity, and professional functioning through calculated actions disguised as unconditional love. You just verbally admitted before a witness that you administered heavy psychiatric medications in my food without my consent or knowledge during a prolonged period. I declared with deliberate clarity, ensuring Rodrigo mentally registered that crucial confession for subsequent legal documentation. This is not maternal care. It's a serious crime of poisoning that will result in severe legal consequences regardless of what distorted justifications you internally constructed to rationalize behavior so obviously abusive and criminal. The atmosphere in the room changed dramatically when Marta realized she had inadvertently confessed to a crime while trying to minimize perception of malice through recontextualization as maternal concern, eliminating the possibility of continuing to deny responsibility or constructing defenses based on factual ambiguity about who had administered the medications found in my system. Carolina, you can't really be considering criminally prosecuting your own mother for actions motivated exclusively by love and concern for your well-being, even if the methods employed were ethically questionable. Marta tried to appeal to traditional family loyalties that historically worked to suppress conflicts through social pressure, about maintaining superficial harmony regardless of underlying injustices. Think about what this would do to our extended family, to relationships with your siblings, and especially to your own community reputation, If people discover you're legally pursuing your elderly mother for simply trying to help you when you refuse to recognize the need for appropriate psychiatric treatment. You destroyed 6 years of my life through systematic poisoning that caused debilitating symptoms affecting every aspect of my daily existence. And now you try to manipulate through threats about potential social consequences of seeking legal justice for the crimes you deliberately perpetrated. I responded with growing conviction, strengthened by Rodrigo's external validation about the objective reality of that situation. Instead of it being simply paranoid delusion, my traumatized mind would be fabricating. Any reputational damage our family experiences will result exclusively from your criminal choices to poison your own daughter, instead of simply talking honestly about concerns you might have about my mental health. Seeking intervention through legitimate medical channels, instead of assuming the role of unqualified physician administering heavy medications, without any appropriate professional supervision about dosages, drug interactions, or monitoring of potentially fatal side effects. Rodrigo reinforced my position with an additional observation that expanded the scope of Marta's criminal responsibility, beyond simply administering medications without consent to the territory of dangerous medical negligence that could have resulted in fatal consequences. Marta, you administered 3 different psychiatric medications simultaneously without any knowledge about potentially lethal drug interactions between these substances. Without monitoring serious side effects these medications can cause, including cardiac and neurological problems. And especially without any appropriate medical evaluation about whether Carolina actually needed pharmacological intervention, instead of simply psychological therapy or lifestyle changes. He analyzed with technical precision characteristic of his analytical personality. You put her life at real risk through amateur medical experimentation, apparently motivated by a need to control an adult daughter who had established independent life, instead of remaining dependent on constant maternal guidance. Rodrigo's accusation about control motivations underlying Marta's superficial justifications about maternal concern apparently touched a deep psychological nerve because her expression changed drastically from defensive posture to something darker that revealed layers of accumulated resentment about loss of direct influence over my life after marriage and establishment of independent family. You were never good enough for my daughter, Rodrigo. I always knew you would eventually pull her away from me, transforming Carolina into a different version of who she was when growing up under my careful guidance. Marta declared with barely contained hostility that finally revealed genuine motivations underlying the systematic poisoning. The medications were necessary to help her see clearly that she was making mistakes in life by prioritizing marriage and career over family relationship with a mother who always put her interests above everything else. The shocking revelation that Marta's primary motivation for poisoning her own daughter for years was not genuinely concern about mental health, but rather resentment about loss of control. When I established independent adult life, completely transformed the moral nature of that situation from possible poorly executed maternal care to calculated revenge disguised as unconditional love. You admitted that you deliberately administered medications to cognitively incapacitate me, hoping that the resulting mental confusion would make me more dependent on you instead of continuing to build independent life with my husband. I articulated slowly, ensuring the gravity of that confession was completely registered by everyone present. This is not maternal love. It's the behavior of a person with a serious psychological disorder who needs to control others through chemical incapacitation when conventional manipulative methods stop working effectively. Marta realized she had revealed too much about true motivations underlying the systematic poisoning, completely eliminating the possibility of constructing a legal defense based on well-intentioned, if poorly executed, maternal concern, and quickly tried to retreat to less incriminating territory through partial denial of those revealing declarations. You're distorting my words and intentions through malicious interpretations, projecting sinister motivations onto actions that were always motivated exclusively by unconditional love, even if specific methods may have been ethically questionable in retrospect, with the benefit of objective analysis. She tried to reformulate with language carefully calibrated to minimize previous criminal admissions. I never intended to cause permanent harm to Carolina. I only wanted to help her through a difficult period of adjustment to marriage and professional demands through pharmacological support that conventional doctors refused to provide because they didn't understand the depth of challenges she was facing. You caused 6 years of progressive damage to my physical health, cognitive capacity, and professional functioning through unsupervised administration of heavy psychiatric medications whose dosages, interactions, and side effects you had no qualification to appropriately monitor. I responded firmly, refusing to allow her to minimize the gravity of the crimes through calculated linguistic reformulations. Family doctors consulted during these years never prescribed psychiatric medications because appropriate clinical evaluations didn't identify a need for pharmacological intervention. But you unilaterally decided that your lay assessment about my mental health was superior to the judgment of multiple qualified medical professionals who performed complete examinations without finding evidence of disorders that would justify medication prescriptions. Rodrigo intervened again with a crucial observation about how Marta's behavior pattern revealed. During that confrontation, suggested a need for psychiatric evaluation of her herself to determine if she was experiencing a personality disorder or cognitive decline affecting her judgment about the consequences of her criminal actions. Marta, a mentally healthy person, doesn't elaborate a 6-year scheme to systematically incapacitate their own daughter through secretly administered medications because they resent loss of control when the adult daughter establishes independent life, he observed with clinical precision. Your behavior suggests a serious psychological disorder that requires professional evaluation and treatment instead of simply legal consequences for the crimes perpetrated. Although both interventions are necessary to protect Carolina from future harm and to potentially help you reconnect with objective reality about the appropriate nature of healthy family relationships between independent adults. Rodrigo's suggestion about Marta needing psychiatric evaluation provoked an intense defensive reaction that apparently revealed a sensitive point about her own mental health that she had projected onto me through forced administration of medications intended to treat conditions she possessed, but refused to recognize in herself. I don't need psychiatric evaluation. I'm perfectly sane and capable of making rational decisions about family care, unlike Carolina, who was clearly showing signs of progressive mental instability for years, but refused to seek appropriate help. She protested with excessive vehemence that betrayed underlying anxiety about the possibility of being herself subjected to psychological scrutiny that could reveal pathologies she had denied for decades. The medications I administered were exactly those prescribed to me by a competent psychiatrist to treat legitimate conditions, proving they were safe and appropriate for use in situations of compromised mental health like Carolina was clearly experiencing. Marta's inadvertent revelation about having used her own psychiatric prescriptions as the source of medications secretly administered in my meals finally provided an explanation about access to the substances found in the toxicology exam, but simultaneously confirmed that she was diverting medications legitimately prescribed for her own use to the criminal purpose of poisoning third parties without appropriate medical supervision. You just admitted that you diverted psychiatric medications prescribed to you by a doctor who presumably believed only you would consume these substances, according to appropriate therapeutic guidelines, and instead used those prescriptions as an arsenal to poison your own daughter for years. I declared with growing incredulity about the depth of ethical and legal violation she had perpetrated. This adds an additional layer of crimes, including diversion of controlled substances, medical fraud through obtaining prescriptions under false pretenses, and especially violation of fundamental trust between doctor and patient, who presumably was treating your genuine conditions, instead of inadvertently providing tools for you to chemically abuse family members. Marta finally realized that each attempt to justify or minimize her criminal actions only resulted in additional revelations about the depth and premeditation of the systematic poisoning, progressively eliminating any possibility of constructing a viable legal defense based on ignorance, good intention, or mitigating circumstances that could reduce criminal responsibility for damages caused during 6 years of secret administration of heavy medications. I think this conversation is over, and any additional communication should happen through lawyers representing the appropriate legal interests of both sides, she declared abruptly, standing up from the armchair and gesturing toward the door, indicating she expected Rodrigo and me to leave her house immediately without continuing a confrontation that was progressively revealing more incriminating evidence. You clearly came here not for honest conversation about family resolution, but rather to extract confessions you can use in upcoming legal proceedings, demonstrating fundamental bad faith that invalidates any pretense of concern about family well-being instead of simply legal revenge. We came here offering an opportunity for you to voluntarily explain the motivations and circumstances of the systematic poisoning before we initiate formal legal proceedings. But your responses confirmed not only criminal responsibility, but also complete absence of genuine remorse or recognition about the gravity of damages caused through 6 years of deliberate chemical abuse. I responded, maintaining my physical position in the center of the room, refusing to be expelled before clearly establishing future consequences of her criminal choices. You will receive formal notification from my attorney during the next 24 hours about criminal prosecution for poisoning, diversion of controlled substances, and especially about a request for a restraining order preventing any future contact with me until a court determines if you represent continuing danger based on mandatory psychiatric evaluation that will be requested as part of protective measures. The mention of a restraining order and mandatory psychiatric evaluation finally provoked a genuine emotional reaction from Marta, beyond the calculated manipulations she had employed during most of that impossible confrontation, apparently revealing real fear about the possibility of completely losing control over family narratives, and especially about the potential of being officially diagnosed with a psychological disorder. She had projected onto me for years through forced administration of medications intended to treat conditions she possessed, but refused to recognize. You can't prevent me from contacting my own daughter through court orders based on exaggerated accusations about actions motivated by maternal love, even if specific methods may have exceeded appropriate ethical limits, she protested with growing desperation in her voice. Judges will understand that mothers sometimes need to make difficult decisions about caring for adult children who don't recognize their own needs for treatment, and especially will recognize that intentions were benevolent even if execution was problematic in retrospect. Judges will evaluate based on objective evidence about crimes committed instead of self-pitying narratives about distorted maternal love justifying systematic poisoning for 6 years. Rodrigo intervened, firmly supporting my position about the need for formal legal intervention. Medical documentation proving presence of 3 heavy psychiatric medications administered without consent during a prolonged period causing substantial damage to Carolina's health. Cognitive capacity and professional functioning will establish solid foundation for protective orders, and especially for criminal investigation about diversion of controlled substances and potentially attempted homicide depending on whether the prosecution determines that administered dosages were sufficiently high to represent lethal risk instead of simply incapacitating. We finally left Marta's house, leaving her alone, processing the imminent legal consequences of criminal choices she had made for 6 years, apparently believing she would never be discovered or held accountable because basic family trust would make investigation of maternal poisoning unthinkable until symptoms became sufficiently severe to provoke comprehensive toxicology exams, revealing the impossible truth about systematic chemical abuse perpetrated by the person who should above all protect, instead of deliberately incapacitate through medications diverted from legitimate prescriptions. The return trip home after the devastating confrontation at Marta's residence was conducted in absolute silence, where both Rodrigo and I individually processed the magnitude of those impossible confessions about systematic poisoning perpetrated for 6 years by a person who should above all protect, instead of deliberately incapacitate through heavy psychiatric medications secretly administered in meals prepared under the pretext of unconditional maternal love, but finally revealed as vehicles for chronic chemical abuse motivated by resentment about loss of control when I established independent adult life. When we finally got home and I closed the front door, creating a physical barrier between my present life and family past that would need to be completely reprocessed through a new and devastating lens about maternal relationship founded on manipulation instead of genuine love, I allowed emotions repressed during hours of confrontation to explode through silent tears streaming down my face while Rodrigo hugged me protectively, offering emotional support without words, because adequate phrases didn't exist to console the trauma of discovering that my own mother had systematically poisoned me for years. The first phone call I made after minimally recovering emotional composure was to attorney Beatrice, a professional specializing in family abuse cases that Dr. Renata had recommended during our conversation in the medical office when we discussed the need to meticulously document the toxicology discovery, and especially to establish legal protective measures before Marta could orchestrate counterattacks based on distorted narratives characterizing the victim as aggressor through typical manipulative inversion of perpetrators, confronted with irrefutable evidence about crimes committed for years without consequences. Carolina, Dr. Renata previously informed me about your situation and especially sent a copy of the toxicology results that prove presence of 3 heavy psychiatric medications in your system, clearly administered without your consent or knowledge during a prolonged period. Attorney Beatrice began with professional efficiency, characteristic of someone accustomed to dealing with complex family abuse cases. I need you to relate in detail everything that happened during the confrontation with your mother today, including specifically any verbal admissions she made about administering medications, and especially motivations she revealed for perpetrating this systematic chemical abuse for 6 years. During the following hour, I meticulously related the complete sequence of events from toxicology discovery to confrontation at Marta's house, including especially her partial admission about having administered medications for distorted maternal concern. and especially the shocking revelation about true motivations based on resentment about loss of control. When I established independent life with Rodrigo, instead of remaining dependent on constant maternal guidance, she apparently psychologically needed to validate her own identity, constructed exclusively around the role of controlling mother. Attorney Beatriz remained in professional silence during my narrative, occasionally asking clarifying questions about exact phraseology of Marta's admissions, and especially about Rodrigo's presence as a witness. During confrontation that would be crucial to establish credibility of allegations in eventual criminal prosecution, where defense would certainly try to characterize accusations as fabrications by a mentally unstable daughter, seeking revenge against a loving mother who only tried to help through unconventional but well-intentioned methods according to typical manipulative narratives of perpetrators facing legal consequences. Carolina, the situation you described clearly constitutes multiple serious criminal violations, including deliberate poisoning, administration of controlled substances without consent, diversion of prescribed medications for unauthorized purposes, and especially continuing crime given that the abuse extended for 6 years with systematic pattern demonstrating premeditation instead of isolated error or impulsive action, Attorney Beatriz analyzed with technical precision. Additionally, verbal admissions that Marta made before a witness about having administered medications, and especially revelations about motivations based on control instead of genuine maternal concern, provide solid foundation for criminal prosecution that the prosecutor's office will likely accept, given the gravity of crimes and existence of objective medical evidence proving chronic poisoning. Attorney Beatriz's professional confirmation about legal viability of criminal prosecution against Marta offered crucial external validation about the seriousness of the situation, instead of it being simply an exaggerated family conflict that should be resolved through therapy or mediation instead of formal judicial intervention, but simultaneously awakened anxiety about the emotional complexity of transforming my own mother into a criminal defendant, potentially facing years in prison for crimes perpetrated against her daughter during a prolonged period disguised as loving maternal care. Before we initiate formal criminal proceedings, I need you to carefully consider the emotional and family implications of legally proceeding against your own mother. Attorney Beatriz continued in a more compassionate tone, recognizing the sensitivity of that impossible situation. Criminal prosecutions for family abuse tend to be prolonged and emotionally devastating for everyone involved, creating permanent divisions in extended family, including siblings and other relatives who will be forced to choose sides during public litigation about allegations many will consider unthinkable or exaggerated regardless of objective evidence, proving the veracity of accusations about systematic poisoning. Attorney Beatriz's warning about potential family consequences of criminal prosecution echoed exactly the concerns that had dominated my mind since the toxicology discovery, when I began processing the impossible reality that my own mother had deliberately poisoned me for years. But vivid memory of those 6 years of debilitating suffering through symptoms that ruined my professional career, marital relationship, and especially overall quality of life, quickly dissolved any ambivalence about the need to seek legal justice for crimes committed regardless of costs to family relationships. Attorney Beatriz, I understand the emotional complexity of criminally prosecuting my own mother, but she destroyed 6 years of my life through deliberate poisoning, and especially demonstrated during today's confrontation, complete absence of genuine remorse characterizing crimes as simply unconventional methods of maternal care. I declared with growing conviction strengthened by indignation about the fundamental injustice of that situation. If there are no legal consequences for the crimes she systematically perpetrated, the implicit message will be that family abuse through chemical means is tolerable as long as the perpetrator can construct narratives about distorted good intentions instead of calculated malice, even when objective evidence demonstrates a pattern of criminal behavior sustained for years. Attorney Beatriz agreed with my reasoning about the need to establish appropriate legal consequences instead of allowing serious crimes to be minimized through appeals to family loyalties or narratives about distorted maternal love justifying fundamental ethical and legal violations, and began outlining a multifaceted strategy to proceed simultaneously with criminal prosecution through formal complaint to the prosecutor's office, and with civil measures including a restraining order, preventing Marta from having any contact with me until a court determined if she represented continuing danger based on mandatory psychiatric evaluation. The first step will be preparing a detailed criminal complaint, including a copy of toxicology results. Your testimony about the confrontation with Marta, including her verbal admissions about administering medications, Rodrigo's testimony as witness of the confessions, and especially Dr. Renata's report contextualizing the medical discovery and explaining how the pattern of symptoms you experienced for 6 years was consistent with chronic medication poisoning instead of genuine mental disorder. Attorney Beatrice explained methodically. Simultaneously, we'll prepare a petition for emergency restraining order, arguing that Marta represents clear and present danger based on history of systematic poisoning, and especially on absence of remorse, demonstrated during confrontation when she tried to justify crimes through narratives about maternal concern. Mino! The weeks following that impossible afternoon when I discovered the devastating truth about maternal poisoning were a period of frenetic legal activity where Attorney Beatrice worked tirelessly preparing documentation necessary for criminal prosecution and restraining order, while simultaneously I navigated the emotional complexity of completely cutting contact with Marta, and especially of informing my sister Juliana about crimes our mother had perpetrated for years, without any of us suspecting the impossible truth hidden under the appearance of loving family care. The phone conversation with Juliana was one of the most difficult experiences of that traumatic period, because I needed to simultaneously reveal the shocking toxicology discovery and confront the possibility that Juliana might not believe the accusations against Marta, or worse, still might already know about the poisoning and have chosen to remain silent out of distorted family loyalty or fear of confronting our mother about behavior so obviously criminal and psychologically disturbing that it defied comprehension through lenses of normal family dynamics. Juliana, I need to tell you something extremely serious about our mother that I recently discovered through medical tests, and that will completely transform your understanding about our family dynamic. I began carefully trying to emotionally prepare my sister for the impossible revelation I was about to make. During the last 6 years, while I struggled against debilitating symptoms that doctors vaguely attributed to stress or anxiety, Marta was secretly administering heavy psychiatric medications in my meals, causing exactly those symptoms through chronic medication poisoning that no doctor suspected investigating because basic trust in family suggested such possibility would be too paranoid to seriously consider. The silence that dominated the phone line after my initial revelation was so charged with tension that I physically felt the weight of that transformative moment while awaiting Juliana's reaction, oscillating between hope that she would immediately believe me, validating my experience and fear that she would reject accusations as fabrications by a traumatized mind seeking conspiratorial explanations for genuine health problems, instead of recognizing objective reality about systematic maternal abuse proven through irrefutable medical evidence. Carolina, this is absolutely insane and impossible to believe that our mother would do something as heinous as deliberately poisoning her own daughter for years. Juliana finally responded in a voice mixing disbelief and growing concern. Are you absolutely certain that laboratory results are correct? And especially that the only possible explanation is Marta secretly administering medications instead of there being other potential sources of that poisoning you haven't completely considered before making such serious accusations against our own mother? Juliana's initial response, demonstrating skepticism about the accusations, was exactly the reaction I had anticipated and feared, because it revealed a common psychological phenomenon where people resist accepting disturbing truths about close family members, preferring to construct unlikely alternative explanations. Instead of confronting devastating reality about the nature of relationships they had presumed to understand intimately during decades of apparently normal family coexistence, but finally revealed as founded on manipulation and control instead of genuine love and mutual respect. Juliana, I have irrefutable medical evidence about presence of 3 different psychiatric medications in my system administered chronically for years, and especially I have Marta's verbal admission before a witness about having deliberately put those medications in my food for distorted maternal concern. She finally revealed was really resentment about loss of control when I established independent life. I responded with forced patience, recognizing that Juliana needed time to process impossible information that challenged decades of understanding about family dynamics. The attorney I consulted confirmed that the situation constitutes serious crimes of poisoning and diversion of controlled substances that will result in formal criminal prosecution against Marta, regardless of whether you choose to believe in the objective reality of that situation or prefer to maintain protective denial about the true nature of our mother. The mention of formal criminal prosecution against Marta provoked a perceptible change in Juliana's tone from defensive skepticism to something closer to reluctant acceptance about possible veracity of accusations that initially seemed too bizarre to represent reality instead of paranoid delusions. but simultaneously awakened anxiety about family implications of public litigation, exposing secrets that traditionally remained hidden within private dynamics protected by loyalties, and especially by social pressures about maintaining appearances of family harmony regardless of underlying abuses. Carolina, if what you're saying is true about Marta having poisoned you for years, then obviously she needs to be legally held accountable for the crimes committed, Juliana finally conceded with evident reluctance. But I need to warn you that this will completely destroy our extended family, creating permanent divisions among relatives who will choose sides based on emotional loyalties instead of objective evaluations about evidence. And especially will expose all of us to public scrutiny about family dynamics we preferred to keep private, instead of having intimate details discussed in criminal court, open to observers, and especially to press, if the case attracts media attention. Juliana's concern about family and social consequences of criminal prosecution was legitimate, but didn't fundamentally alter the need to seek justice for crimes Marta had systematically perpetrated for 6 years, destroying my physical and mental health through deliberate chemical abuse disguised as maternal care. Because allowing serious crimes to be minimized or ignored by pressures about maintaining superficial family harmony would establish a dangerous precedent implicitly validating abuse as long as the perpetrator could construct narratives about good intentions, instead of calculated malice. During the following month, while attorney Beatrice finalized preparation of criminal complaint and petition for restraining order, I began the painful but necessary process of reconstructing understanding about decades of maternal relationship through a new and devastating lens, revealing patterns of manipulation and control if I had normalized as simply maternal personality traits, instead of recognizing as evidence of deep psychological pathology that eventually culminated in systematic poisoning, when conventional control methods stopped working effectively, after my marriage and establishment of independent adult life. Intensive therapy with a psychologist specializing in family abuse trauma was crucial to process the emotional complexity of that impossible situation, where I needed to simultaneously validate the experience of having been victim of a serious crime perpetrated for years and especially navigate conflicting feelings about the perpetrator, who, despite having committed obviously criminal and abusive acts, was still my biological mother with whom I had shared decades of memories that needed to be completely reinterpreted, but couldn't simply be erased as if they had never existed. Carolina, it's completely normal and expected that you experience emotional ambivalence about criminally prosecuting your own mother, even while rationally recognizing that she committed serious crimes deserving appropriate legal consequences. Dr. Sylvia explained during one of the first therapy sessions. Maternal relationship is one of the deepest and most psychologically complex human bonds. So discovering that the person who should protect above all was actually systematically poisoning you for years creates fundamental trauma about trust in relationships, and especially about understanding of your own personal history that needs to be completely reprocessed through new perspective about family dynamics that were abusive instead of loving as you had believed for decades. That, Doctor, to you? Sylvia's words validated the emotional confusion that had dominated my mind since the toxicology discovery, when I began processing the reality that decades of maternal relationship I had interpreted as love instead of control were fundamentally based on psychological manipulation that eventually escalated to chemical abuse when Marta lost the ability to control my life through conventional methods after a marriage she clearly resented, as a threat to the absolute maternal dominion she had exercised during my childhood and youth. The court hearing for the emergency restraining order happened on a cold Tuesday morning, exactly 6 weeks after the toxicology discovery that had completely transformed my understanding about the family reality I had unconsciously inhabited for 6 years of systematic poisoning disguised as loving maternal care. And it was the first time I saw Marta again since the devastating confrontation at her house, when she verbally admitted before a witness about having administered medications through meals prepared under pretexts of concern about my adequate nutrition. Marta was accompanied by a defense attorney, who presumably had advised her to completely deny the accusations, or alternatively partially admit medication administration, but characterize actions as well, intentioned if poorly executed maternal care, instead of deliberate crimes motivated by psychological need to maintain control over an adult daughter who had established independent life. But the expression on her face when our eyes briefly met across the courtroom revealed a mixture of resentment about being forced to confront legal consequences for crimes perpetrated, and especially fear about the possibility of completely losing control over family narratives through formal judicial intervention. The judge responsible for the hearing was a woman of approximately 60 years with an expression simultaneously compassionate and serious that suggested decades of experience evaluating complex family abuse cases, where objective reality frequently diverged drastically from narratives presented by both sides based on emotionally charged perspectives, instead of objective analyses about documentary evidence that should ground judicial decisions about protective measures potentially restricting fundamental communication rights between family members. I understand from documentation presented by petitioner Carolina that she alleges having been victim of systematic poisoning during a 6-year period through non-consensual administration of heavy psychiatric medications in meals prepared by respondent Marta, who is petitioner's biological mother. The judge began concisely summarizing central allegations. Medical evidence includes toxicology results, proving presence of 3 different medications in petitioner's system in concentrations consistent with chronic administration during prolonged period. And additionally, there exists witness testimony about respondent's verbal admissions, confirming having deliberately placed medications in petitioner's food due to concerns about her mental health she allegedly wasn't seeking appropriate treatment for. The judicial summary of allegations and evidence presented the case in an objective and clinical manner that contrasted drastically with the devastating emotional charge of that situation for me, while processing the trauma of sitting in criminal court formally accusing my own mother of crimes that had destroyed 6 years of my life through systematic chemical abuse no doctor had suspected investigating until Dr. Renata trusted her professional instincts, requesting comprehensive toxicology panel revealing the impossible truth about chronic medication poisoning. Marta's defense attorney began argumentation trying to minimize the gravity of accusations through characterization of actions as misdirected but intentioned maternal care instead of deliberate crimes deserving restrictive protective measures. But the judge quickly interrupted that line of reasoning with a cutting observation about the irrelevance of subjective intentions, when objective actions caused substantial damages through clear violations of bodily autonomy and informed medical consent that are fundamental rights protected regardless of family relationships between perpetrator and victim. Counselor, I understand you're trying to contextualize your client's actions through a narrative about maternal concern, but non-consensual administration of heavy psychiatric medications for 6 years, causing medically documented debilitating symptoms, constitutes serious crime regardless of alleged motivations. The judge declared firmly, immediately establishing that the court wouldn't tolerate attempts to minimize seriousness through appeals to family loyalties. The central question for determining if emergency restraining order is appropriate is not whether respondent had good intentions as she claims, but rather if she represents continuing danger to petitioner's safety based on pattern of behavior demonstrated during 6 years of systematic chemical abuse, and especially based on apparent absence of recognition about gravity of perpetrated actions. The judge's intervention establishing clear parameters about case evaluation based on objective facts instead of emotional narratives offered some hope that the restraining order would be granted, legally protecting me from additional contacts with Marta until complete psychiatric evaluation could determine if she was experiencing a personality disorder or cognitive decline affecting judgment about consequences of actions, and especially about appropriate nature of family relationships between independent adults, instead of controlling dynamic that had characterized maternal relationship for decades, culminating in systematic poisoning. After hearing arguments from both sides and carefully reviewing medical evidence documenting presence of unprescribed medications, and especially Rodrigo's testimony about Marta's verbal admissions during confrontation at her house, the judge granted emergency restraining order with 6-month duration, preventing Marta from having any direct or indirect contact with me, including communications through third parties or social media, and especially ordered that Marta submit to complete psychiatric evaluation that would be considered in future hearings about permanent extension of restraining order, or alternatively about possibility of supervised contact if evaluation determined she didn't represent continuing danger. The granting of the restraining order offered crucial legal protection against potential attempts by Marta to continue manipulating or harassing through contacts that could be characterized as reconciliation attempts, but that in reality would represent additional efforts to establish control through emotional pressures about family loyalties, or especially through construction of narratives where she would be victim of an ungrateful daughter, instead of perpetrator of serious crimes deserving appropriate legal consequences through formal criminal prosecution that Attorney Beatrice had submitted to the prosecutor's office for evaluation about viability of formal charges. The prosecutor's office decision about accepting criminal complaint against Marta arrived approximately 2 months after the restraining order hearing, when the prosecutor responsible for reviewing the case concluded that medical evidence combined with verbal admissions documented through witness testimony established solid foundation for criminal prosecution for deliberate poisoning, non-consensual administration of controlled substances, and especially diversion of prescribed medications for criminal purposes instead of legitimate therapeutic use according to appropriate medical guidelines that presumably accompanied original prescriptions. Carolina, I received notification from the prosecutor's office confirming they accepted the criminal complaint against Marta and will formally prosecute for multiple charges related to systematic poisoning during 6 years. Attorney Beatriz informed during a phone call I received on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Criminal prosecution will obviously be prolonged, potentially extending for a year or more, depending on defense strategies, and especially on result of psychiatric evaluation the court ordered as part of the restraining order, because if evaluation determines that Marta was experiencing delusional disorder or significant cognitive decline when she perpetrated crimes, this could affect her legal capacity to be criminally tried, or alternatively could result in reduced sentence based on mitigating circumstances related to compromised mental health. The possibility raised by Attorney Beatriz about psychiatric evaluation, potentially revealing mental disorder that would affect Marta's criminal responsibility, created conflicting feelings where part of me wanted her to be considered fully responsible for crimes perpetrated for years without mitigating circumstances minimizing gravity through convenient psychiatric diagnoses. But another part recognized that a mentally healthy person probably wouldn't elaborate a 6-year scheme to systematically poison their own daughter out of resentment about loss of control when she established independent adult life. The mandatory psychiatric evaluation report conducted by court-appointed expert arrived 3 months after the restraining order and contained surprising findings about Marta's mental state that contextualized, although didn't completely justify criminal behavior she had perpetrated for years through systematic poisoning disguised as loving maternal care, but finally revealed as manifestation of severe narcissistic personality disorder exacerbated by growing anxiety about loss of control when her adult daughter established independent family-threatening maternal identity that Marta had constructed exclusively around the role of dominant mother. Psychiatric evaluation determined that respondent Marta presents symptoms consistent with narcissistic personality disorder, characterized by pathological need for control over family members, inability to recognize adult children's autonomy, and especially tendency to interpret establishment of independence by children as personal rejection, deserving retaliation through behaviors designed to restore dependence. Attorney Beatriz summarized during a meeting to discuss implications of the psychiatric report. The expert psychiatrist observed that systematic administration of medications causing debilitating symptoms was consistent with narcissistic behavior pattern where perpetrator seeks to create artificial dependence in victim through incapacitation that forces return to previous controlling dynamic, and especially noted that Marta demonstrated during evaluation absence of genuine empathy about suffering caused focusing exclusively on her own emotional needs to maintain central maternal role, instead of recognizing adult daughter's autonomy. The psychiatric findings finally offered explanation about motivations underlying the systematic poisoning that had seemed so bizarre and incomprehensible when I initially discovered the truth through toxicology exams, but simultaneously created a moral dilemma about whether Marta should be treated as criminal perpetrator fully responsible for actions, or as mentally ill person needing intensive psychiatric treatment, instead of simply punishment through incarceration that probably wouldn't resolve underlying psychological pathology feeding abusive and manipulative behaviors. The mediated agreement that eventually avoided complete criminal trial was negotiated approximately 8 months after initial toxicology discovery through combined efforts of Attorney Beatriz representing my interests, Marta's defense attorney, prosecutor responsible for the criminal case, and especially mental health team including expert psychiatrist who had conducted evaluation revealing narcissistic personality disorder as explanatory, though not justifying context for crimes perpetrated during 6 years of systematic poisoning. Terms of the agreement included formal admission of guilt by Marta about charges of non-consensual administration of controlled substances in exchange for suspended sentence conditioned on rigorous compliance with intensive psychiatric treatment for minimum of 3 years including weekly therapy and appropriate medication for personality disorder, maintenance of restraining order, preventing any contact with me during minimum period of 2 years, subject to re-evaluation based on progress demonstrated in treatment, and especially issuance of formal letter of admission about crimes committed, an apology recognizing damages caused through 6 years of systematic chemical abuse. The admission and apology letter that Marta signed under supervision of attorneys and medical team was the most difficult document to read during that entire traumatic process, because it finally contained explicit recognition about perpetrated crimes, and especially about motivations based on pathological need for control instead of genuine maternal concern, validating an experience that had been systematically denied for years when doctors attributed symptoms to stress instead of recognizing them as evidence of chronic medication poisoning no one suspected investigating, due to basic trust in presumably healthy family dynamics. The months following that mediated agreement were a period of gradual reconstruction, where I slowly began recovering cognitive functionality and emotional stability that had been progressively destroyed during 6 years of systematic poisoning, especially through complete discontinuation of exposure to medications Marta had secretly administered, and through intensive therapy processing trauma of discovering that maternal relationship I had interpreted as love was fundamentally based on pathological manipulation and control, culminating in chemical abuse when conventional methods stopped working. Rodrigo was an exceptional partner during that impossible recovery period, offering constant emotional support while simultaneously processing his own anger about having witnessed my suffering for years without suspecting that debilitating symptoms were caused by deliberate poisoning instead of genuine mental disorders we had believed were affecting my health, despite absence of definitive diagnoses even after multiple consultations with specialists who never considered possibility of chronic medication poisoning. The decision about eventually allowing supervised contact with Marta after the minimum 2-year period stipulated in mediated agreement remained an open question. I would periodically revisit based on recommendations from mental health professionals monitoring her progress in psychiatric treatment, and especially based on my own emotional willingness to potentially rebuild some form of maternal relationship founded on mutual respect and recognition of autonomy, instead of controlling dynamic that had characterized decades of family coexistence, culminating in crimes that irreversibly transformed the nature of all future relationships. 2 years after that impossible morning when I discovered through toxicology exam that my own mother had systematically poisoned me for 6 years, I finally achieved a sense of restored normalcy where I functioned professionally without the debilitating mental fog that had dominated my existence during the prolonged period of chronic medication poisoning. My marital relationship with Rodrigo had been strengthened through the process of facing together the trauma of that devastating discovery. And especially I had developed deeper understanding about the importance of trusting instincts when inexplicable symptoms persist, despite superficial medical evaluations, vaguely attributing problems to stress, instead of investigating underlying causes through comprehensive tests like the toxicology panel that eventually revealed the impossible truth. The most important lesson I learned through that traumatic experience was that family abuse can assume insidious and difficult to detect forms that defy understanding through conventional lenses about family dynamics. And especially that basic trust in close relationships can paradoxically facilitate perpetration of serious crimes when victims and medical professionals dismiss possibilities that seem too bizarre to represent reality, instead of considering unlikely hypotheses when clinical evidence doesn't make complete sense through conventional diagnoses about mental or physical disorders. Did you like Carolina's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there because I'll be waiting for you.